around was sort of talking about it's not just a few bad apples that are at fault here, that it's basically the whole tree, and it's a structure, it's a problem to do with structural racism. Sorry, somebody saying something?
Sorry, his name, he's just joining us.
Oh, okay. And, you know, so it's about structural and institutional racism that feeds into the brutality that's aimed at, you know, Black people. And this outrage against the killing of George Floyd has resonated throughout the world, and lots of countries are pointing to their own systems of oppression, you know, whether that be racism or whether other systems of oppression where police brutality has been a feature of that. And obviously we know that in Britain that's not, it also resonates with Britain because we've got a long history of police brutality, both against sort of working class people and against black people. And I've got some figures and things here for you if you want them. The Home Office and Ministry of Justice say that there's about a quarter of the prison population that comes from minority communities. Yeah, 26% of the prison population are from minority groups, and the Lamy report, and what was the other one? There were two reports, wasn't it? One's a Lamy report and one's another one. And that Black people are 2 times more likely to die in police custody, 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched, 3 times more likely to be arrested, etc. So, you know, we can see here that these sorts of practices are ours too. We've also had deaths in custody, you know, right from the 1970s onwards at least, if not 60s. We've had Joy Gardner, Cynthia Jarrett. More recently, there's been Mark Duggan, Adrian McDonald, Habib Abdullah. If you look at the Institute of Race Relations site, there's a whole list of people. Kingsley Burrell in Birmingham, all died at the hands of the police. And oh yeah, the other review was the Angelini review with Lamy review as well. In the States, Rodney King, Charlottesville and stuff. In 2014, there's Laquan McDonald, Ferguson. All of these have been, you know, police brutality cases, deaths at the hands of police, where men and women have died. And then in the States in particular, this is not the first time that there's been a visual evidence of a person being killed right in front of your eyes, basically. There's Rodney King's was that, and a few others were that too. So audiences have seen this happening right in front of their eyes, and so, and often that's resulted in riots where the police have come in, and even in the States, militarized versions of policing as well. So, and I think, you know, the mechanisms that are used to legitimize these practices are mainly to do with how Black people are represented. They're structural. You know, policing itself arises from structural causes. That it originates from the history of the working class in Britain, when you've got peasants and people moving from the land to the cities, and those labourers are perceived as and constructed as dangerous. The mass classes, the masses coming into the cities, and they're posed as criminalised people who need to be repressed and suppressed. And you know, there's so many riots and things that happen right across the centuries, and policing is obviously a way to suppress that. But in order to legitimize those, there's very often people are constructed as criminals, and Black people in particular have been victims of that, where they're dehumanized and humiliated and perceived as uncivilized savages, dangerous, aggressive, sort of shady characters, of violent, a menace to society, who need to be controlled. So policing, together with other practices, disciplines and controls these dangerous sections of the population. So they're either constructed as sort of dangerous to society, and with regards to Black and working class people, particularly dangerous to middle class women, but also as sometimes docile, backward and passive and compliant, who can't control themselves and who are therefore in need of control and discipline. So either way, it's the victim that gets it. The culpability is the victims. And so those sorts of perceptions allow you to lynch people, to kill and maim and torture and rape, incarcerate as you like. And through that, then you can sort of marginalize, exploit even more. And that's been seen, in America. So many Black people are incarcerated that they've lost the right to democracy in the way they can't vote. Sometimes years, or for to sort of 14 years or so in some states, where they've got to get permission after they come out of prison. And it's not just men that are being killed by police action, it's also women, but the focus tends to go on to men, but women are usually haven't been the focus of much media attention, although what's that campaign, Say Her Name, so along with Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name is also another campaign that tries to bring out the practices against Black women as well in terms of police brutality. So the police are not really there to provide public safety. They're not the guardians of the public. They are actually there to discipline and control us. And their mentality is very much sort of warlike mentality. They sort of think that they are, soldiers in the battle all the time, that entire communities that are constructed as suspect and criminal have to be controlled. And that's their role. So very often when you've got any of these high profile cases, or when you've got uprisings and stuff, very often the solution that's posed is that, we need to either retrain and train police officers so that they can practice better, or that that you should have more representation in policing of both, Black people, minority groups, other minority groups, and women, etc. But those sorts of things, they might work in terms of the front. You've got a better front to sort of negotiate and communicate with, so they might work in terms of communication, but they don't address the very basic structural questions that are to do with inequality, economic inequality, political inequality. So they won't work unless you actually change those structural inequalities in the first place. So that's my contribution. Any help?
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, can I just say one more point? I forgot. Was that what's happening to Black people right currently is also reflected in the war on terror practices. So all the abuses of human rights, and if we see what happens in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay and stuff, they are still practices that were humiliated primarily men, along similar sort of racist lines as well. Okay, that's it.
Okay, Abu,
Abu raised his hand.
Yeah, I mean, the comrade touched upon the Muslims being a suspect community. I mean, you got the prevent program, and I've been approached twice by prevent myself and asked questions about, you know, why am I so involved in politics and all that kind of stuff. What do I think about Palestine? And names helped me in the past. Names helped me with them prevent as well. So, I mean, I don't know if anybody could possibly add or articulate prevent better than me, but if you can, just go ahead.
Serena could do that too.
Anybody? Yeah, prevent is you know, a way of criminalising primarily Muslim people, and that's what it's doing. Not just adults, but children. So they're starting from very, very young members of the community to criminalise them, and that's certainly been one of the ways in which, or one of the techniques that have been used to criminalise and to imprison people in Britain and to terrify Muslim communities.
I just
There's a couple of points. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, just a couple of points that I just was interested in coming out of the current events, which are a bit different from the way Serinda's approached it. One is specifically in relation to the United States and the black population, but it's very general as well, because the whole basis of racism is in imperialism and colonialism. So you can say that, in a sense, Britain is largely responsible for what happened in the United States because they exported the racism to the United States initially anyway. But the black population are particularly significant because they have been brought to the United States as slaves, and they were set up as a community of slaves, an underclass, specifically chattel slaves, for many generations, and in many ways that neo-slavery has continued and still continues today for that specific community. And so I think there, one of the questions is whether there can ever be any change, just particularly talking about United States, whether there can be any change whatsoever, unless the black people in America get not just justice, but freedom. And the Comintern view on the American black community was that they actually constituted a nation and they had the right to self-determination as a nation. Now, whether or not that is correct, whether or not that has continued to the present time, I don't think is the main point. The main point, I think, is the struggle of the black people has got to be something more than just saying we want equality, we want freedom, because we know that doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen because they are an oppressed population. And in my view, what they should be, what they are struggling for, and the Black Power movement had it correct. It's for freedom. And the second point, which I think is, no, I'll leave it at that. Actually, I think I've said enough.
Okay, thank you. Paul?
Yes, well, thank you, Surinder. I just wanted to try to propose to locate, as you implied yourself, the current murder of black people in America, which I think is termed necropolitics, the politics of death, necropolitics. And there's a very important book which people may not have heard of, written by some called Wakant. In 2010, it's called Punishing the Poor. Do you know this book? Are you familiar? Surinder, yeah. So for people who are not familiar with I Can't, it talked about the hidden hand of the market and the iron fist of the state, and the two are connected. In other words, necropolitics is really a function of a neoliberal state, and the rise of imprisonment, what other people call the carceral state, state to incarcerate people, took off in sheer numbers as neoliberalism took off in the 70s and 80s. And behind all this notion of necropolitics is a notion of white supremacy. So white supremacy is not just the bizarre ends of radical white in the deepest South of America. White supremacy is an ideology which pervades the whole of Western institutions. And as you pointed out, James pointed out, it's linked to colonialism. White supremacy is not just a couple of bizarre, hard cases going around killing people. It's built into the very framework of society, which pervades and permeates the whole of the world through a conduit of colonialism. So, as James has indicated, this is deeply embedded. And interestingly, I just happened to read today that in the Senate, United States Senate, they vetoed the anti-lynching bill. Now, for 100 years, progressive liberals have tried to have a federal bill against lynching. And in 2020, it was vetoed by some members of Congress. So an anti-lynching bill has been vetoed even this week, as this poor guy was murdered. And there's a link between what happens in America and lynching, which emerged out of the Jim Crow laws and the Reconstruction period, the post-war in America. And you might be around 5,000 people were lynched between 1890 and 1950. 5,000 people were lynched. Some were burnt alive. Many were tortured. Many people had their bodies cut up. So, as James has pointed out, and as Surinder has suggested at the beginning, this war against black people and poor people, white working class, but in particular black people, has been going on for 150 years. Soon after the Civil War in America, the Reconstruction period, white supremacy and its visible manifestation, which is lynching, has persisted. And in essence, this guy the other day was lynched, in inverted commas. And there have been lynchings in America ever since. And there's a famous case in 1951, so a young black boy called Emmett Till, who was accused by a white woman of flirting with him. She told her husband, this young black man tried to flirt with her in a shop. Her husband rounded up a posse and he was murdered and tortured to death. On her deathbed in 2017, this woman confessed she made it all up, it was a lie. And that's what happens. And there's a recent case, you may have heard about a recent case in New York Central Park.
Yes.
A black man was bird watching in a part of the park which is given up to bird watching. and a white woman came up with a dog, which was barking, snapping at his heels. And there was a sign there saying, "Keep your dog on the leash," because it's a bird watching area. And he asked her politely and civilly to get her dog away and to put it back on its leash. And she got hysterical, and she said she's phoning the police and she's going to say there's a black man here trying to murder me. She phoned the police, and the black man kept his composure. He simply took out his phone and he phoned her, phoning the police, and he phoned her and he recorded her comments. And so he had proof that he was innocent, and she was making up this bizarre story about him trying to threaten and murder her. And this thing went viral because his film was posted on social media and went viral. It just illustrates that even something as innocent as bird watching can provoke an accusation against this black man by a white woman who tend to be believed. So there's nothing new about the murder of this man the other day. It's endemic, it's intrinsic to American society. And of course, to some extent, that's true also in Britain. There aren't so many deaths. There are fewer killings, but it's the same phenomenon operates. This white supremacy and ideology which permeates every institution. Sorry?
It's the same phenomena, you know, South Africa, Australia.
Yeah, these are the hard cases. These are the hard cases which upset liberals. But in their own backyard, it's happening.
Yeah.
So why
There's
do
an interesting book by Caroline, is it Caroline Anderson? And she talks about white rage.
Yeah.
But I think it's what she's talking about is white fear, that it's, you know, white people are actually afraid of black people, that should they get any mobility, that they'll have their own back in a way, which sort of makes sense to me, you know.
Yes, Kalpana?
Yeah, what I wanted to say, I've sort of read articles and statistics and figures over the years, and sort of intellectually I understood, you know, that both here and in particularly in United States, that the criminalization of black people, there's a lot more people were picked up, violated, imprisoned over the years. But to actually see a man being murdered on the street and being watched, and I sort of felt just watching the video that you're participating in that lynching, if you like, or killing and the violence. And if it's all systematized, and it is, because having black president and things hasn't made any difference. You know, the whole system has just continued. Number of killings has continued way before Rodney King and has continued subsequently. It's how do you highlight it? How do you fight it? And so there are all these demands that are coming from the black community there about you know, economic boycott. They got to develop the power and independence to be able to fight the system, and in a way, rest of us have to support that. In this country, I think I sent that interview, ITV interview. I mean, there is a tendency to think that things are a bit easier here, and I think because the police don't carry guns, whereas there's not immediate shooting of people on the street. But the SUS laws and subsequent modified laws or whatever, and now prevent acts and things, they are basically against minority communities for whatever reason. So the state does use both violent and legal means of discriminating. Sort of Stephen Lawrence's campaign managed to bring down the institutional racism to the fore, but things haven't really changed to that extent. And it's how do you actually keep bringing that again and again? You know, that making one or two changes is not sufficient. It's actually recognizing the day in, day out, constant. Yes,
I mean, you know, it's that same question, you know, if the system, if policing itself is there to support the ruling class, as it were,
yes.
you know, how do you change that? Even if, you know, like Jim's saying, if Black people were supposed to have a nation of their own, would it be a nation of the poor? Would it, you know, if it ends up like any other independent country and stuff, the policing will be there to, and is there to support the ruling class, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think it's with such a, I think to see that, oh, sorry, to see that so blatant. I mean, the policeman just so blatantly could do that. That, you know, he knew he had the support of the state. You know, and
I mean,
okay,
that happens. I mean, we've seen this even with this COVID stuff. I've seen hours of footage where people, in India, the police are beating people to, you know, pulp when with sticks and lathis and stuff. And people stand there staring and actually say, yes, they deserve it.
yes.
So it's not a new thing at all. Hello?
Hello.
Can I make another point about
Yeah.
Wacant's analysis? It talks about the carceral state and describes a continuum, which is, on the one hand, what's called prison fare. Prison fare is the use of the justice system, the legal system, to quieten and make docile and lock up people, and this is the iron fist of the state. And it's described, it targets men in particular, Black men, working class men, Black men. So prison fare is organised and set up to manage and control dangerous men. But on the other hand, in this, and I might share this as Surinder, being a social worker, social work background, of course, workfare or the social care system or the welfare system is a soft version of prison fare. So you have this continuum of workfare and prison fare. The workfare or social benefits welfare is a medium by which women are controlled. So, controlling poor women, in particular poor Black women, is done through social services and the social benefit system, what in America has now become called workfare. And conversely, the men are managed through prison fare. So it's a part of a much bigger picture. It's a continuum. So the carceral state is about managing urban marginal groups. So there's also a link here about urbanity. It's about how the city is policed and controlled. And you have these carceral neighbourhoods, or what used to be called ghettos, which the ring put around these marginal groups of people, and it's the boundaries which are policed by the frontline shock troops who manage the carceral state. And that's where you get confrontation and encounters. It's on these territorial boundaries where you get deaths occurring because the police act as a shock troop. So if you want an exaggerated version of this, think of the Nazi brown shirts in Germany who went around brutalizing people and using fear and intimidation, supported by the state, to intimidate the opponents of Nazism. The shock troops, and then of course behind them you've got the concentration camps. So you know there's a link between the prison system and the role of the police force. They're part of the same thing. But so let's not just think about prison fare and incarceration of black men. Think also about workfare and the control of black women. It's all part of the same thing.
Can I
Yeah.
make a comment? So, I quite agree with Surinder that the state systematically identifies the groups or communities which it labels dangerous, and then applies the measures to control them, discipline them, punish them. Now, I think there are a couple of other things that is that not only the state does that, but the entire society is in a uninterrupted sort of is continuously trying to identify the groups of people who are morally corrupt. That these groups or communities are not only dangerous, but they are morally corrupt, morally evil. And in the present era, where there is a lack of any kind of supernatural framework within the prevalent discourses, or we can say that the prevalence of naturalism in the present, whether it is a left-wing, whether we see left-wing discourse or right-wing discourse, it's not surprising that this moral corruption or the moral evil presents itself or is presented as cultural evil or worse, genetic corruption. So you can see that there are plenty of academic articles talking about black men's hypermasculinity, or you have a general sense that of predatory Asian Muslim men threatening the moral virtue, safety, security of primarily white Western women. And this is a accepted thing. This is not only the state doing it, but this is the mainstream of the society has accepted these particular points, and therefore it becomes the bodies of the black men or Asian men or men from oppressed communities become a legitimate target for the systematic, violent, and legal means to what Surinder was saying, to control them, to discipline them, to punish them, these particular pathological bodies, so that the society can function as it is supposed to function. Yeah, that particular bit.
But that's the embodied white supremacist viewpoint. It's not just a state perspective, it's a perspective ingrained in white people's mentalities.
That's
white
right.
supremacy refers to exactly what you're describing.
That's right. Yeah.
So, Paul, do you think this white supremacy is associated with the rise of imperialism, capitalism, and imperialism, or it was already embedded before?
Well, the notion of whiteness was first articulated in about 1650. The notion of whiteness was first articulated in the 17th century in a context of the North American colonies. It was first used in some legislation when North America was a British colony. Some states there started referring to whiteness as a legal category. And so, yes, if you're a Marxist, you argue quite clearly that the rise of white supremacist viewpoints, what is called racism, white supremacist viewpoints emerged with plantation slavery to justify slavery. White people are innately superior and non-white people are innately inferior. which is the essence of white supremacy, has two consequences: that the inferior peoples must be controlled, managed, looked after, and patronized and disciplined. But also, secondly, from a white supremacist point of view, it's very important there's no cross mixing. The notion of misgeneration, the notion of interbreeding is taboo. So the notion of whiteness began in North America as a concept, a legal concept, to describe who could vote, and B, to prohibit who could marry. So it's about interbreeding and political entitlements. So that's where the notion of whiteness was first articulated, and it became part of a discourse of racism, discourse of plantocracy, plantation slavery, and of course that evolved into a broader capitalist perspective around colonialism. So the whole of India was governed by the British Empire based upon white supremacist viewpoints. In one benign sense, it's actually to civilize people there. In a more hard sense, it's designed to control and punish people for economic exploitation. So white supremacy as a concept has been around since the 17th century, and it clearly correlates with the rise of capitalism. You can debate cause and effect, that's another story.
So it's basically...
So the distinctive feature is pseudoscience that goes with it, isn't it? That white people are actually superior. But I mean, last week we were talking about the Aryan race in caste. And although that's got no pseudoscience, attached to it, the two systems seem very similar. It's not about, the caste is not about whiteness in a sense, but there is some form of color distinction, isn't there?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how the two are related. Obviously, like you say, the Marxist line is that racism is specifically related to colonialism and stuff. But
well, the plantation slavery perspective, of course, supported originally from reading biblical text. And the biblical Christian Bible is used to justify slavery. The people know the story of Ham, and so on and so forth, where some texts in the Bible suggest that black people are there to serve white people. So the original plantation slavery ideology, which out of which emerged the concept of whiteness, drew inspiration from the Christian text. And as Surinder points out, we've been moved into what's called scientific racism later, where we're looking at genetics and head shapes, all sorts of things. There's meant to be a scientific basis to the difference between races. But the outcome is something called white supremacy. I can't imagine how you can begin to undermine it, because it's everywhere. A little bit of training here and there, I went through the 70s when we went from what's called racist awareness training. It's just all liberal stuff. The idea is that if you could teach white people to be self-conscious about this and that, they'll stop being racist, or they stop supporting racist institutions. This is very naive stuff. White supremacy is embedded in European and North American culture and elsewhere, wherever the empires took root, whether it's Spanish, Portuguese, German, French or British, you'll discover that white supremacy has been implanted in that cultural landscape. You are all victims of white supremacy. I'm not, but you are. It's a part of your culture framework. It's a deeply profound, deeply evil phenomena, manifests at every level of existence. When you walk down the street you encounter a white person, you engage in a white supremacist encounter. It's part of your calculations. You know, it's how it works. Deeply embedded.
Surinder is quite the link that Surinder invoked between the white supremacy and Aryan supremacism, which we were talking about last week. It's quite interesting because the caste in Sanskrit is also called Varna or Varna.
Yeah.
Varna basically means color.
Color.
Varna basically means color. If you go to Indonesia or Malaysia, in Bahasa, Indonesia and Malaysia, which Indonesia and Malaysia were colonized by the South Indians, South Indian dynasties, and you have remnants of Sanskrit present in their languages. So if they call color as Varna, and that is, you can see that the Gaur-Varna or the Aryans colored themselves as because they were whiter compared to the Dravidians or native South Indians, which now they are South Indians. The hierarchy, the kind of a colorist hierarchy is there, and there is definitely a link between that, and you can see this particular link when various extreme right-wing ideologues, or in some cases terrorists, write these manifestos, and they are talking about that there is a need of making links between the Indian right-wing, RSS and so on and so forth, and the European right-wing, which is happening anyway. But there was a Norwegian terrorist, Breivik, Andre Breivik. He wrote a 800 pages long manifesto, and in that manifesto, more than 100 pages, he dedicated of the need of Europeans to connect and join hands with their Indian Aryan brothers. So there is a very important link there, ideological link and practical in what is happening behind the scenes and maybe right in front of our eyes as well. Now, Paul was saying that, Paul also said one thing very important, that how can we challenge this white supremacy? So, or how can it be dismantled and so on? So my question to that, counter question would be that who wants to do that? And the answer to that would be very simple: the people who are suffering from it, right? So they are the agent of change, and unless it's simple power dynamic. If the oppressed gain the power, by all means, by whatever means are necessary, if they gain the power, then they can change the equation. They can challenge the equation. They can topple the equation. They can chuck the equation, white supremacist equation, in the bin of the history. But unless they gain the power, that's not possible. I mean, these protests and A to Z march or A to B march and whatever else can keep happening, or maybe they are also part of challenging the white supremacist, the legitimacy of the white supremacism, which is very, very embedded, as Paul has rightly pointed out. So maybe this is whatever is happening is part of a bigger, larger dynamic. But there is definitely a need to recognize that this cannot be changed unless the people who are suffering from the consequence, from this particular dynamic, this power imbalance, put in effort to take the power in their own hands.
Abu wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, in America, after the civil rights movement, the liberals thought that the answer to police brutality against blacks was having more black police officers, but that hasn't really changed the racist the racist policing. So I think possibly under a socialist, a more socialist society, where socialism eradicates a lot of the poverty, you see less desperate people doing desperate things to survive, and But in the UK, I don't think the answer is more BAME police officers. It has to be something more radical. I mean, I don't know what we could. I don't know what we should demand really from the police. Not more BAME officers for sure, but I don't know what comrades would think what we should demand.
I don't know what we should demand, really. Not more community policing, because we've had that. Liberal, the liberal, even the left have sort of promoted that at times. And as I said, yeah, you can have more representatives, but that's not going to do anything. So
there is one strategy to pick up Saif's point, which you may regard as being a little more than pointless, but the one thing people can do, and that includes the likes of me as well as black people, is to expose and make visible the nature of domination. Domination is successful because it's invisible. And people with reputation, in this case, white people, are often unaware that their behaviours, their attitudes, their well-being is predicated upon domination of black people for a variety of means. So, and even today, no one likes being called a racist. There are a few who relish the idea, but most white people, I surmise, will feel horrified if they expose or called racist. So there's a taboo in liberal democracies about racism. The fact that it's invisible to those who perpetuate it is one of the issues. So one can begin to chip away at this edifice by exposing how people's denial of their own domination is in fact true. So this is an approach which is about speaking truth to power. I mean, all of a sudden, how long would it last? All of a sudden, a vast number of white people have suddenly realised that if you're born black, it's an occupational hazard. It comes with a health warning. Your chances of survival are limited, and life could be nasty and brutish, and you can be dead one day without even realising it. And I think what this current crisis has done has at least awakened a proportion of white people to this is going on. And we're seeing, in particular, young white people come out to demonstrate on the streets. Exposing the nature of domination and repeating it is an approach which has, I think, some practical benefit.
I think it's only a small step, though, isn't it? Because that's a lot of that assumes that domination is based on ignorance. But so making people aware is a part of the story, but power is usually taken and not given.
Absolutely,
so,
yeah. Yeah.
Excellent point. But yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, we can see this particular skewed power dynamic within the COVID pandemic. The likelihood of a black man dying significantly higher compared to white men and women, and you can see a lot of people in medical community on YouTube, people talking about that this might be related with genetics and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm not averse to this particular line of thought, that if there is, but there has to be hard data to back this big claim. It's very similar to saying that black people are lower in IQ because they have genetically they are different or inferior compared to white people or Asian people and so on and so forth. We don't have hard data, and this is going on on YouTube. You can see this, people talking about this kind of stuff. but they're not talking about how Black people or people coming from Asian background and so on and so forth, they are living in impoverished conditions. So very simply that they, I mean, just to point one thing, that they lack vitamin D. The vitamin D levels are relatively low, and that makes them susceptible for respiratory infections and so on and so forth. I mean, Dr. Kalpana is here, so she would be better placed to comment on that, but there is plenty of research on that. Why are we not talking about that, but we are talking about other things? And this is very commonplace. So unless
Yes.
the people who are suffering challenge it, and not just challenge it to make some sort of a token gesture, that is to point from march from point A to point B once a year or 2 years, or whenever these kind of things happen, but a consistent effort with the focus on taking the power in their own hands. I don't see anything changing much. I mean, there will be some, but whatever. Yeah.
By challenging and taking the power, can we define this a bit more clearly? Are we talking about raising average incomes, or how? What do we mean by this?
I don't want to define that. I won't. There is a reason why I don't want to define that, because it is the Black people, it is the people who are suffering, it is the people who are on the forefront. They should be defining it. What does it mean for them to take the power back? From a Muslim perspective, yes, or from an Asian, South Asian perspective, we can say that taking back the power would be to be in a position to make decisions which are going to affect our lives significantly. We have to be in that particular position. So we have to create organizations, we have to create institutions, if that means creating parallel institutions, not only just the institutions within the present institutions of the status quo, but parallel institutions. That's also one of the options. But it needs to be done. It needs to be done. People need to realize that they have to challenge the power structures, and they have to take the power in their own hands.
I think an example of sorry, go ahead.
Yes. Sorry, I mean, in relation to two things, really. I mean, Malcolm X talked about that in terms of house Negro and field Negro, and person who had least to lose is likely to be the, going to resist is, talking about slavery. And a lot of the Black civil rights campaigns and things were about controlling their own economy, not, boycott of the white businesses, boycott of the buses, so on, to try and get the economic power and build their own political organizations. So, I mean, there have been attempts, and then the Black Power in America actually came up, supported use of guns if necessary to support, but they did a lot of community work within the Black community. So it wasn't just purely violence for violence sake, but they basically got they basically got smashed by the white state. And so it's a sort of constant and continuous struggle till large group of people are able to free themselves. So that's one. And the other bit, talking about genetic and medicine and disease, I mean, that's quite an involved involved subject anyway. There are obviously genetic variations, but in relation to COVID, the fact that more Asian people have diabetes, hypertension, more Black people, overall Black and Asian people have obesity problem, economic problems. So all the different factors were adding towards the increasing risk. And the genetic, if there is a variation, it's very minimal. But I think there is this constant need to define science in that sense. You know, if they have this sort of genes, then that sort of disease occurs, rather than, well, actually majority of things are actually quite controlled by the social effect. You know, social class and nutrition, etc., education level. So yeah, I agree that, you know, if they had all that already, data already about this, that you know, they haven't used that. They haven't come to use it. Now they're relying on trying to do a genetic analysis. But I mean, the fact is the service is not there. The service hasn't been provided, even when there has been various diseases. And the Black Report talks about all that, you know, going back to what, in 1980s, in relation to UK. Yeah. I mean, the racism, we talk about racism, yeah, racism even in health distribution and healthcare that exists. It's provided by Black people, but it's also the way it's provided to Black people varies. You know, somebody was today actually talking about how the cystic fibrosis and sickle cell disease provision of services within NHS, how varied it is, because cystic fibrosis affects Caucasian white more, majority, and sickle cell more with African, and the service that's provided is very, you know, obviously differential, discriminatory. And that the campaigns against that has been going on since, again, 1980s, and it's still going on 30 years on. So yeah, I mean, I would support the institutionalized racism in all aspects of our lives, as opposed to what we can do. I sort of feel we got to do something. You can't just say, well, it's, you know, just accept it, really. I think so, even if it's little and even if it's not, you know, complete or successful, I think we got to constantly highlight the problems anyway. That needs to be done.
Dr. Kalpana is quite, it's very interesting that she highlighted about how this struggle of taking back the power is going on, and how the society, or particularly state, reacts to that. So if we take two examples here, Black Panther Party and the Weathermen Underground. I don't know whether people know Black Panther Party, probably
yeah,
most
Black
of us
Panther
know.
and Weathermen, yeah.
Weathermen Underground. So Black Panther Party and Weathermen Underground, they both were socialist, revolutionary socialist, anarchist sort of groups in the US. And they were organized on those particular principles. Black Panther Party was mostly Black people were there, and Weathermen Underground, most of them were white. And the reaction to both of them is really interesting, how the US state reacted to them. Black Panther Party was completely annihilated. A lot of their leaders were completely brutally murdered by the police. And Weathermen Underground, I mean, if you look at the history of people who are in Weathermen Underground and where they are, they're all professors and lawyers, and they're all fine. They're absolutely okay. There are a couple of them who were engaged after the Weathermen Underground dissolved, and they were caught by the police and for various things, and then incarcerated. But apart from 2 or 3 people who were engaged in Weathermen Underground, most of them are absolutely fine. So there is a significant difference between the reaction of the state when it reacts to what we can call Black autonomous groups, as well as compared to white revolutionary socialist groups. And this needs to be kept in mind. That is why I'm insisting here that it is not up to us. I mean, people here, obviously people who are being affected by it, you know, they will define whatever they will define, however they will define. But it is the people who are on the forefront. They have to define what it means to take the power back, because they will face the very serious repercussions from the state, from the society, and I mean, not only the state, but the general society, how it maligns the people for over decades, over the number of years, their character, their motivations, and so on and so forth. It plays right on the tune of white supremacism.
Yes,
It's a really, really important point.
If you look at the data on lynching in America from after the Civil War, 65 onwards, 25% of lynchings were a result of allegations of rape by black men against white women. But a much higher proportion of lynchings were actually directed towards successful black people. So typically, a free black slave may set up an enterprise and compete with a white enterprise down the road, and that store would be torched, and that black man would be murdered or lynched. There's a clear economic imperative behind lynchings. People stress historically it's about the fear of white women and black men coming together, protection of so-called white women's purity, allegations of rape, and even looking at a white woman could cause you to be lynched. But if you look at the data, the majority of the cases where after the Civil War, many ex-slaves set up businesses and small farms and become successful business people. They were living the American dream, so to speak. And those are the people who were murdered. So it's clearly an economic factor to control the black people. The idea of there are in fact black towns in America which evolved for black people after the war in America, which still survive. But it's a very difficult job to keep them going, and they're under constant surveillance and threats of torture. The biggest issue about lynching, and I regard all the current murders as a form of modern day lynching, the biggest thing about lynching in the 19th century was not the fact of murders themselves, which is bad enough, is that it forced many black people to migrate, to move away. In other words, it was the fear of being lynched which controlled people's lives and produced docility. And in many cases, many black people just left and went to the north and went into the cities to become part of the working class and kind of a 19th century version of precarious work. So let's not disregard the economic imperative behind white supremacy. It's not just cultural. And going back to the point about this current epidemic. Yes, we can talk about people's dispositions, obesity and this and that, heart disease, which are diseases of poverty. But I suspect, I have no data, but I suspect that if you analysed the referral system, I suspect that black people get into the hospital system much later.
Yeah.
In other words, their arrival into hospital is much later than white people, therefore they're more prone to die. I suspect accessibility.
Yeah.
How's a black person with symptoms of the virus get help? How are they treated medically? How do they get into the hospital system? I suspect that many of those deaths were caused by the fact that they arrived too late. That access barrier is a part of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of other factors than that.
Yeah, just going back on that point about white black businesses in America, they burnt down a place called Black Wall Street. You know, I don't know if you read about Black Wall Street, and because the black people were doing good. They were making money. There was a developing middle class, and
yeah, exactly my point. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just ask if what would policing look like in a socialist society? Does policing ever not represent the state and not represent a disciplining force, do you think?
I saw an article in Rojava. They have a different type of, Rojava in Syria. They have set up a socialist state there. In Aleppo.
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 Oh, yeah.
Yeah. They have set up a different type of policing there. I saw an article that how to do a socialist policing, but I didn't read it. I should have read it.
I think there'll be less, economic, less economic inequality. The people will be more financially stable, less poverty, so there'll probably be less police.
But Surinder's question is much more fundamental. That is, whether we are talking about socialist society or capitalist society, in whatever way the society is organized, can the police be not representative of the state or the ruling class, whatever the ruling class might be? At least that's what I understand.
Yeah, it's an organ of a state, and whichever state, whoever controls the state power.
Yeah, and therefore police is basically a force of disciplining and punishment. Now, I mean, we can question those particular actions of disciplining and punishment themselves, whether they are morally right, whether they are ideologically correct from our perspective, and so on and so forth. But there is no denying that the police is representative of the state. It cannot be disentangled. That's my view. That's definitely it.
Yeah, I think.
If you go to Cuba, you find the policemen there are very nice people.
Okay.
They are. I mean, historically in Cuba, the police were used to persecute gay people, for example, during a period of time, which has since changed. Cuban police, well, as you point out, the police represent society and the state, and that's the so-called liberal democrat contract. Is that the people agree that the police are there to police society and to discover criminality and make sure they get punished or rehabilitated or whatever the current philosophy you have is. So that's the point of the police. In Cuba, people get arrested for misdemeanors. They have been arrested, of course, for being dissidents. That's what police do. When I was a social worker, I knew lots of nice, good policemen and women. And I knew a few bad ones as well. It depends what they're tasked to do. Depends what they're tasked to do. That depends upon the society in which they actually get paid.
Okay, shall we end this discussion? It's more than 1 hour.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Surinder.
Thank you,
Surinder.
everybody.
Thank you, James.